Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah Schelke, Sarahschelke, attorney for Michael Clark and his family. With me, I have his adult children, Cynthia Flagell, Cynthia Flageolle, and his son, Jeremy Clark, Jeremy, Clark, no E, and also my wonderful staff from my office. We are here today to announce that we have settled Mr. Clark's lawsuit against the city of Idaho Springs and its officers for a record-breaking amount in a civil rights case in Colorado, almost certainly and possibly nationally as well, for a case that does not involve death. We have settled Mr. Clark's lawsuit for $7 million, and we are here today to offer some comments and thoughts on that moving forward and answer briefly questions from the press as well. First, as it happened a little while ago, a recap of what occurred and what got us to this kind of a settlement is in order. And it all began on May 30th, 2021, a day that for Mr. Clark began with him being able to drive, walk, do everything independently, which included putting flags on the graves of fallen soldiers at the Fort Logan National Cemetery. He retired that night to his apartment after eating dinner in Idaho Springs and went to sleep. And he awoke around 11 o'clock to very loud banging on his wall, which he knocked back, told him to knock it off, and went back to sleep. What Mr. Clark didn't know was that his new neighbor, Brittany Odom, who was impressively intoxicated and a convicted liar, didn't like being told to be quiet. She decided she would call the police and claim that Mr. Clark had punched her in the face and knocked her out. Idaho Springs police officers Nicholas Hanning and Ellie Summers responded to this call. When they arrived, they spoke to the drunk Miss Odom for no more than 95 seconds, during which they learned that she did not have any visible injuries to corroborate her claim, that there were no witnesses to the fantastical event that she was describing. She was not sure which apartment her alleged assailant even lived in. Her story, even as she told it, kept changing and becoming inconsistent, and there was no physical evidence anywhere to corroborate her story. What the officers did next remains shocking and is hard to watch in the video. They marched over to Mr. Clark's apartment door. They began banging on it, standing on either side so that he could not look through the peephole to see who was banging on his door in the middle of the night. They did not announce they were police officers. And so Mr. Clark, very reasonably believing that someone who was banging on his door intended him harm, grabbed a collectible sawfish snout sword off of his shelf for protection on the way. And when he unlocked the door, the officers popped out, and Hanning jumped over the threshold of the doorway and punched him with his flashlight-bearing hand and kicked him. He told Mr. Clark to put the sword down, which Mr. Clark did. He walked several steps back, put it away, and returned to the door. It is hard to imagine a more vulnerable and helpless-looking person in their own home than what Mr. Clark looked like at that time. 75 years old, wearing only boxer briefs, and standing there doing nothing threatening whatsoever, contrasted with the two Idaho Springs police officers who simultaneously began ordering him to get out of the apartment and to lay down, which was impossible. Well, they also, Officer Summers, got her firearm out and pointed it at his chest, and Officer Hanning got his taser out and pointed at preparing to tase Mr. Clark in his own home. These officers did not have the training nor any interest in de-escalating this encounter, and instead did what appears to be a cultural phenomenon with police in this area, which was to violently and frenetically escalate it. This culminated in Officer Hanning tasing Mr. Clark without warning, which fired into his stomach, electrocuting him and causing him to fly backwards into his apartment, where he hit his head on a piece of furniture on the way to the ground. I wish this was the end of the story, but a settlement like this doesn't happen unless things get really bad, and get quite bad they did, because these officers were not done with Mr. Clark. They converged into his apartment and without exchanging a word began to drag his nearly naked and lifeless body out into the hallway. He was making gurgling sounds, indicating difficulty breathing. Neither officer called for medical assistance. Instead, they rolled him onto his stomach, and Officer Hanning put his knee into the back of Mr. Clark's neck. It stayed there for over 20 seconds while they put his lifeless, unconscious body into handcuffs in the hallway. Finally, after over a minute and a half without having called for medical, the officers called for an ambulance, and still yet they were not done. Officer Hanning stood up while Mr. Clark was still lifeless, naked in the hallway, and he marched into Mr. Clark's apartment. He retrieved the softish snout sword from back where he had put it up on the shelf, and he walked it out to the hallway and he chucked it down the hall. Because you cannot claim that you tased a man for coming to the door with a sword or coming out with a sword unless you put the man and the sword in the hallway. Officer Summers watched Hanning do this and made neither comment nor objection. Mr. Clark was brought to the hospital that night. He was, and the officers followed him there. And Officer Summers told all of the medical treating staff that he had assaulted an officer and would need to be restrained. At the hospital, Mr. Clark continued to be mistreated. This is a man who has spent his life dedicated to service, no criminal history, who was worried about his cats getting out of the apartment. And what nobody knew or could have detected at that time is that when Mr. Clark's head hit a piece of furniture on the way down after being tased, it began a small bleed in his brain. It was a bleed small enough to not be detected by the CT scans that they did. Oops, grab that. Thanks. It was small enough that it was not able to be detected at that time, and it was beginning to impact his behavior. However, nobody was really paying very much attention to the changes to his personality at the hospital because they had been told by Officer Summers that Mr. Clark was violent. And over the next 6 weeks, while everybody had concern over his heart from the tasing, over the stroke he had 36 hours later, all of these other medical problems distracting them, the bleed in Mr. Clark's brain continued to grow until one day, 6 weeks later, Mr. Clark, sitting at home with his family having dinner, began to have a seizure. He seized at the table in front of his daughter, her children, and their children, and had never had a seizure before in his life. They were able to get him to the hospital, where he was immediately taken into emergency surgery and required to have 3 burr holes drilled in his head to drain the subdural hemorrhage that had built up to that point. The recovery was long and awful, as any kind of brain surgery is, but what was lost is far worse. Mr. Clark is now today, a year later, at what his doctors are calling maximum improvement and he is permanently brain damaged. He cannot cook. He cannot bathe himself. He cannot use the restroom himself. He is wheelchair bound. He cannot drive a car. He cannot do the things that he loves. He cannot pan for gold. He cannot take a walk down the street with his grandchildren. He has lost everything as a result of what these officers did. Now, there were some things outside of that recap that I wanted to mention that we learned in the discovery of this case, because I saw that the Idaho Springs Police Department issued a press release themselves about this settlement this morning, stating that, again, trying to hew to their narrative that this is a bad apple situation, that it was just Hanning, that this is not the culture of Idaho Springs Police Department. And that's simply not true. What we learned in the course of depositions and discovery in this case is that this is very much the culture at the Idaho Springs Police Department. Hanning, in his deposition, described having seen his fellow officers tase people in the back who were just walking away. He described seeing his fellow officers regularly tase people for mere verbal noncompliance and representing no threat. None of them ever disciplined. We learned that Officer Hanning, after he and Officer Summers assaulted a deaf man, Brady Mystic, in September of 2019, which is a lawsuit that's still ongoing. He had a broken bone from tackling Brady, a deaf man who came closer to them to try and sign and communicate. Hanning was on desk duty while he recovered from this broken bone, and when he returned, he did not complete his required taser training before the Idaho Springs Police Department put that taser back in his hands. And something else we learned in this case, which is particularly harrowing, I learned, not through the case discovery, but by attending the criminal sentencing for Officer Hanning in this courthouse, where his criminal defense attorney stated on his behalf at the sentencing hearing that in the days and weeks leading up to this assault on Mr. Clark, Mr. Hanning told his bosses that he still had PTSD from the assault on the deaf man a year and a half earlier, that he did not feel safe returning to work or returning to full patrol, and that he was extremely tired and overwhelmed. This came from his own attorney at his sentencing. And what I learned in the case discovery when I went and requested all these documents from the police department afterwards is that it was quite true. And this police department just did not care. When I look at what has happened right nearby in the Clear Creek County Sheriff's Office with Christian Glass, when I look at where these officers come from to get to Idaho Springs and Clear Creek Sheriff's Office and where they try to go next, it becomes very clear that this is a systemic problem. And when I watched and this family experienced what this district attorney's office did to protect the officers involved in destroying Michael Clark's life, you can see that the problem is not just in the policing. It's an entrenched institutional problem that is making this community more dangerous for the citizens in it. And it's not from crime, it's from the policing. It's of grave concern. This settlement shows that the insurers can appreciate the value of the loss that Mr. Clark has suffered, but it says nothing about any intent to reform or improve by the police departments in these mountain towns. And that should be worrisome for anybody here, because you will not see in Idaho Springs press release or in this settlement agreement is any commitment to change or any admission of guilt. It should not add more danger to call police for help. And what we're seeing over and over again in these cases is that it does. We had hoped that we could have had Michael here to give a statement. He is so eager to be heard, and unfortunately with his medical condition and consulting with his doctors, it was the concern with his heart condition made worse by the tasing in this case that it would be too much. However, he did prepare a statement. It took considerable time to prepare that I'm going to read on his behalf. This is what Michael Clark wants everybody to know. He says, "This was not just for me. I fought for other people. I lost everything. They took everything from me. I lost my whole life. Money will never repay what they took, but maybe this much money will make them think about doing this to someone else. I know there's other victims who don't have a voice, who don't have the help I had. While I've been fighting for my life, my kids have been fighting like hell for me. But there are other victims of bad police officers who aren't so lucky to have had my family and my attorney making sure that their voice was heard. Those are the people I think about a lot. In the end, I will never get back what they took. All I can hope for is that what we did in this case and in getting this amount of money will make there be less victims. To save just one person from going through what I've had to go through, that's all I want." From Michael. Many will recall very recently, we were just announcing, I think about this time last year, the settlement in the Karen Garner case of $3 million. That was also a client of mine. And if you're looking for a connection between the two cases, I certainly think that there is one, not necessarily in the fact that they're both elderly, but in the fact that these are vulnerable people. These are vulnerable populations who more than anything need their police to protect and serve them, who are being targeted instead. And this is a big red flag for the problems that we are seeing appear that have been going on all along, but are only becoming more visible thanks to body cameras. And the lawsuits certainly help to bring attention to it, but it's going to be on the police departments themselves to make the change for it to stop happening, for those police to stop this compulsive need to escalate encounters and inject and infuse them with violence. It has been a long and arduous and emotional journey for this family getting here. For Cindy and for Jeremy, it's been a living nightmare. And I'm so proud of them for how they fought for their dad. I'm so proud to know them. It's been an absolute honor to fight for these two and for Mike. And with that, they both have a statement they would like to give, and I'm going to hand it off first to Jeremy.
I'm not the best public speaker, and I had to write this down or I'd never remember what to say. So first, I never imagined something like this ever happening to someone I know or love. I am sad to be standing here in front of you all, having to talk about something so tragic, but easily avoidable with the right people in training. I hope we never see someone standing in front of you guys like this talking about settlements for someone hurt by the people meant to keep them safe. The sad reality is that this is not a one-time event, especially in Idaho Springs and Clear Creek County. If my dad's settlement can make someone think twice before they act and prevent this from happening even once, or more likely, if it does, make sure they pay for their wrongdoing. until we stop treating these serious actions as a simple mistake and handing out slaps on the wrist, we will continue to have press conferences like this. The simple fact is, the night before Memorial Day 2021, my father was brutally attacked by a member of the Idaho Springs Police Department as another officer let it happen. On that night, while my father laid tied to an ambulance gurney, these two officers stood feet away from the EMTs discussing how hard he hit his head. Based on the body cam footage, neither officer relayed it to the EMTs or the ER staff. These 4 blows to my father's head, the first being hit in the back of the head with a flashlight, the second being hitting a steel dining room table chair as he fell backwards, unable to protect himself as he was being tased. The third blow him hitting his head on the floor of the apartment building, and the fourth and final blow from the officer yanking my father's arm as he lay unconscious, face first into a bookshelf in his own apartment. These 4 blows to my father's head were the cause of what doctors call a moderate traumatic brain injury. They didn't relay critical details to the EMT or ER staff. Doctors did not find out until months later when he was rushed to the hospital after a seizure at the table while his firstborn grandson and him sat and talked. This event required emergency life-saving brain surgery. The Idaho Springs Police Department and the Clear Creek County TA did not release the body cam footage promptly, preventing us from showing my father's doctors what actually happened that evening. This settlement doesn't even come close to repaying my father or our family for the past 18 months of torment we have endured. We don't know how much more time we will be able to spend with our father, but this money will be used to pay for his medical care and allow him to have his second best life, since his best life was ripped away from him. We will also help fight for and help make fundamental changes here in Colorado and to help this from happening again. And if it does happen again, be here for support and guidance for other victims and their families. And that's all I have.
Thanks. Cynthia.
Good morning. As I stand in front of you today, one could say we should be happy about this, excited even. Although the reality is that we aren't. This settlement will help provide Dad with care that he needs and give us the ability to provide for his needs and wants, and he deserves every penny of it and more. But it doesn't bring him back to who he was and how he used to live. Our father went from doing everything he loved when he wanted and on his own to having to have someone with him to care and assist him 24 hours a day. He went from being able to get out of bed on his own to having to call for help simply to transfer from his bed to his chair. From making his own breakfast to having to have it made for him. From being able to use the restroom by himself to having to call and ask for help just to get to the restroom. He was able to drive and venture here in these mountains that he loves so much, which is what brought him up here, to always having to be a passenger in the car now. He has gone from being able to tell us stories of his life and his childhood to not being able to remember what he did earlier that day or the day before. He went from being able to lay down in his own bed on his own and enjoy his independence to having no independence at all. The events of May 30th, due to an intoxicated individual with a history of lying to police and a few untrained and dangerous officers, not doing their job led to our father having everything ripped away from him, and now we have to try to give him back as much as we can while caring for him 24 hours a day. Months ago, we sat in a courtroom and listened to Judge Cynthia Jones say that the trial on the criminal case with Nicholas Hanning would make the victim, our father, relive the events of that night. What she failed to see is that due to his injuries he sustained and all that he has been through and lost, he relives it every time he can't do anything he used to do. He relives these events day in and day out and will for the rest of his life. I have read some reports that you as media have written just today, and one of them included a statement from the city about these events and this lawsuit. Still, 18 months later, I am continued to be disgusted by the lack of accountability on their part. Acknowledging it was poor judgment on the officers in this case indicates that only the officers involved made poor judgment, when in reality, many people made poor choices and showed poor judgment throughout all of the city officials. We are hoping that this settlement will help provide Dad with everything that he needs, and we are hoping to be support for any future victims and past victims. And we are hoping that this settlement opens eyes and starts making changes across all of Colorado, but definitely here in Idaho Springs and Clear Creek County. And that's all I have right now.
We can take some questions.
Yes, that's right.
Is it safe to call the police in Idaho Springs?
No, it is not.
Cynthia and Jeremy, can you share how sad it is that your father can't be here today and why that is?
His health doesn't, especially in the altitude, he has issues coming up here, and he's currently is sick. So he couldn't be here today, and he's very upset he couldn't be here. You know, we've done a lot of this without him, for him. While he's been fighting for his life, and that's what he needs to focus on is staying healthy and continuing to, he's strong. That's something that this case has shown and is a silver lining for us is, you know, this has been horrible, but it has shown us the strength and determination that our father has and the kind of man he is, and it's definitely provided us with examples that we want to follow. So as upset as he is not to be here, he's focusing on what he needs to be, and he's very thankful for everybody that's been involved helping him throughout this process.
What do you hope future accountability will look like for Clear Creek law enforcement?
I hope that future accountability makes them accountable just as you and I would be. If we went to the door and did this to my father, we wouldn't be standing here. You know, we'd be in jail. We wouldn't have gotten a slap on the wrist and a little bit of probation. So I'm hoping that training changes come about, officer changes come about, and everybody is held accountable just like we would.
You talked about the press release from the Idaho Springs Police Department and how they seem to be saying this is the action of one officer. You described how there's two officers responding to this exact event. Does that fill you with rage?
Disappointment.
Yes.
They
And
still
disgust.
don't understand the magnitude of that one event in one individual's life and how it is cascaded.
They don't seem to take accountability for the I mean, it's easy to put it on Officer Hanning, and to be honest with you, prior to all this we were very angry, but we see a bigger picture now, and yes, it's very infuriating to know that they still are not taking accountability.
How do you feel when you attend protests and vigils for members of the community like Christian Glass who have dealt with similar incidents from the police?
I'm sad. I wish that what happened to Dad, as horrible as it is, would have brought change sooner and prevented things like that, and I hope that it prevents future, but it's, you know, Dad lost a lot, but they lost more, and I'm sad about that.
Any other questions?
Sir, can you just talk about why the fact that the Karen Garner case, a lot of people thought that was really bad. That one settled for $3 million. Why do you think this case settled for even twice that?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons. First is just the loss. The loss that Mike has suffered is unquantifiable, and it's brain injury. When you damage somebody's brain and make it so they can't do daily activities, that's that is some human suffering that really has a big number on it. The other reason, though, is because first of all, thank God for it, Colorado's Law Enforcement Accountability Act, the legislation that's has been passed here, is really making a difference. The fact that we did not have to mire this case and years upon years of litigation while the other side raised qualified immunity defenses and any other number of stall tactics in order to deflect or avoid responsibility. With the new cause of action under state law that was passed back in June of 2020, this police department knew they were going to be liable for what Nicholas Hanning did. And the law is very clear. Even if you criminally charge the officer for the conduct, if the police department was a cause in the civil rights violation, the city has to pay for it. And I've looked at Idaho Springs' budget. They don't have $7 million laying around. This was they didn't have probably anywhere close to what we were going to get if this went to trial. But what was important here is that Mr. Clark needed the money and he needed the help. He needs full-time care as soon as possible. The insurer was willing to take accountability. I think the insurers have a much better eye on what the problems are with these cases, but we're missing something here, which is who's going to take preventative measures to make it stop happening again? Who's going to say, you know what, let's put $7 million into giving these officers more training, into actually teaching them and instilling in them and hiring the ones who are interested in de-escalation rather than getting to play with their new military toys. So I'm going to keep fighting, and I'm going to keep shedding a light on and sharing body cam videos from these events again and again and again, and toting this podium around as we get the settlements until somebody bridges the gap between the insurers and the police departments who are causing the harms, who are inflicting the violence upon their communities. Sadly, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, because they're just not attracting the candidates that they need to do these types of jobs safely. And when you're talking about a small mountain town like Idaho Springs and Clear Creek, you're not getting the best that policing has to offer. Well, a lot of the citizens of these communities don't know is they are getting the officers who couldn't get a job anywhere else, who have applied at about 10 other places or just been convicted of a crime in another state and need to pop over here. This is where they end up, and it shouldn't be that way. And I'm going to fight until it stops being that way. Anything else? Thanks, everyone.